$18 billion per week. That's what sustained military operations against Iran will cost, according to classified Pentagon projections accidentally released for 23 minutes on January 28, 2026, before being removed from public access. More than most countries spend on their entire military budgets annually. More than America allocates for infrastructure maintenance, educational funding, or healthcare systems combined. Consumed weekly by conflict with a nation that spends $25 billion on defense annually. But here's what makes Iran conflict costs historically significant. They represent the exact same military expenditure pattern that has destroyed every empire in recorded history when fiscal crisis meets military overextension. The sequence is mathematical, the timeline is predictable, and Iran represents the perfect military trap for an empire already facing debt mathematics beyond sustainable management. This has happened before. 3 times in documented imperial history. Same pattern, same devastating outcome. And the Pentagon cost projections confirm that America has entered the final phase of the same cycle that destroyed Roman fiscal capacity, eliminated British imperial resources, and triggered Soviet economic collapse through military expenditure beyond economic sustainability. While mainstream analysis focuses on military strategy and geopolitical positioning, the leaked cost data reveals something that only becomes visible when you understand imperial fiscal mathematics. This isn't about Iranian military capabilities or American strategic objectives. This is about what happens when empires facing a mathematical impossibility attempt military solutions that accelerate rather than solve underlying economic breakdown. By the end of this analysis, you'll understand exactly what $18 billion weekly represents, why it matters more than military outcomes or strategic objectives, and what historical precedent tells us about empire survival when military costs exceed fiscal capacity, because there's a mathematical certainty here. A relationship between military expenditure and economic sustainability that no empire has ever overcome once conflict costs exceed revenue generation capacity. The projections have leaked, the mathematics are clear, the only question is whether you'll recognize what Iranian war costs actually represent. Every empire in recorded history has discovered that military conflicts during fiscal crisis accelerate rather than prevent imperial collapse through expenditure patterns that exceed economic capacity, regardless of military outcomes achieved. Military victory becomes economically meaningless when achieved through costs that bankrupt the empire attempting to secure strategic advantages through force projection beyond sustainable resource allocation. Iran conflict represents the perfect mathematical trap for empires facing fiscal impossibility because asymmetric warfare capabilities maximize opponent expenditure while minimizing defender costs through geographic and strategic advantages that extend conflict duration indefinitely. Roman Empire faced identical military mathematics during Persian campaigns between 230 to 284 AD, when fiscal crisis met military expenditure beyond imperial economic capacity. Roman military superiority was absolute. Persian Empire could not match Roman technological advantages, training standards, or logistical capabilities through conventional military comparison. Roman victory appeared inevitable through superior force application. But Persian asymmetric warfare strategies maximized Roman expenditure while minimizing Persian costs through defensive positioning that extended conflict duration beyond Roman fiscal sustainability. Roman armies required extensive supply lines across hostile territory. Persian defenders operated from established positions with local resource access. Roman expeditionary costs multiplied through distance while Persian defense costs remained stable through geographic advantages. Military campaigns that Romans projected would conclude within months extended through years of costly operations that drained imperial treasury without achieving decisive strategic outcomes. Roman military expenditure exceeded imperial revenue generation by margins that required currency debasement and taxation, increases that triggered domestic unrest and provincial rebellions. Military success against Persia became economically catastrophic because costs exceeded benefits regardless of tactical victories achieved through superior Roman military capabilities. Persian campaigns accelerated Roman fiscal crisis through military expenditure beyond economic sustainability, while failing to generate territorial or commercial benefits sufficient to offset operational costs. Roman Empire survived Persian conflicts militarily while suffering fiscal breakdown that eventually eliminated imperial capacity to maintain military operations anywhere across Roman territory. Military overextension during fiscal crisis destroyed Roman economic foundation faster than Persian military resistance, while creating domestic instability that completed imperial fragmentation. British Empire experienced identical military mathematics during colonial conflicts between 1850 and 1920, when imperial overextension met military expenditure beyond British economic capacity. British military dominance was unquestionable. Colonial resistance movements could not match British technological superiority, naval power, or professional military training through conventional warfare comparison. British victory appeared guaranteed through overwhelming force advantages. But colonial asymmetric resistance strategies maximized British expenditure while minimizing resistance costs through guerrilla warfare that extended conflict duration beyond British fiscal sustainability. British expeditionary forces required global supply chains and permanent garrison deployment. Colonial resistors operated from local knowledge with community support. British operational costs multiplied through distance, while resistance costs remained minimal through indigenous advantages. Military campaigns, projected to conclude, rapidly extended through decades of expensive operations that consumed imperial resources without achieving decisive control over hostile populations. British military expenditure exceeded colonial revenue generation by margins that required domestic taxation, increases, and debt accumulation that triggered economic instability and political opposition. Colonial military success became economically unsustainable because costs exceeded benefits regardless of tactical victories achieved through superior British military technology. Colonial conflicts accelerated British fiscal deterioration through military expenditure beyond economic capacity, while failing to generate administrative or commercial control sufficient to justify operational expenses. British Empire maintained military superiority while suffering economic breakdown that eventually eliminated imperial resources to sustain global military presence across multiple colonial theaters. Military overextension during economic transition destroyed British fiscal foundation, while creating domestic constraints that completed imperial retrenchment towards sustainable territorial limits. Soviet Union faced identical military mathematics during Afghan conflict between 1979 and 1989, when ideological expansion met military expenditure beyond Soviet economic capacity. Soviet military superiority appeared decisive. Afghan resistance could not match Soviet conventional forces, air power, or logistical systems through direct military confrontation. Soviet victory seemed inevitable through technological dominance. But Afghan asymmetric warfare strategies maximized Soviet expenditure while minimizing resistance costs through guerrilla operations that extended conflict duration beyond Soviet fiscal sustainability. Soviet forces required extensive supply lines through hostile territory. Afghan fighters operated from established positions with external support. Soviet operational costs escalated through geographic challenges, while resistance costs remained distributed through decentralized organization. Military operations projected to achieve rapid political control extended through decade of expensive deployments that consumed Soviet resources without accomplishing strategic objectives. Soviet military expenditure exceeded economic benefits by margins that required resource reallocation from domestic infrastructure and industrial development that triggered systemic economic deterioration. Afghan military occupation became economically catastrophic because costs exceeded any possible benefits, regardless of tactical successes achieved through superior Soviet military capabilities. Afghan conflict accelerated Soviet economic crisis through military expenditure beyond sustainable capacity, while failing to achieve political control or strategic advantages sufficient to justify continued operations. Soviet Union maintained military presence while suffering fiscal breakdown that eventually eliminated economic capacity to sustain military operations domestically or internationally. Military overextension during economic crisis destroyed Soviet fiscal foundation while creating domestic constraints that triggered complete political collapse. 3 examples spanning 15 centuries. Identical military pattern, identical fiscal outcome, identical imperial destruction through military expenditure beyond economic sustainability. Now let me show you why Iran conflict follows this exact historical sequence with accelerated timeline due to modern warfare, cost multiplication. Iran military capabilities, specifically designed to maximize American expenditure through asymmetric warfare strategies that exploit geographic advantages and regional alliance networks. Iranian missile systems threaten American naval assets across Persian Gulf, requiring defensive positioning that multiplies operational costs. Iranian proxy networks throughout Middle East expand conflict theater beyond bilateral operations. Iranian geographic position controls critical choke points that extend supply line vulnerability. American military response requires expeditionary operations across maximum distance with complete logistical support through hostile regional environment. Iranian defensive operations utilize established positions with local resource access and minimal supply chain exposure. The mathematics favor Iran through cost multiplication factors that historical precedent shows always destroy fiscally stressed empires attempting force projection beyond sustainable resource allocation. Pentagon cost projections reveal Iranian conflict mathematics through detailed analysis that was accidentally released before classification review. Daily operational costs, $2.6 billion for naval operations in Persian Gulf, $1.8 billion for air operations throughout region, $900 million for expeditionary ground force support, $400 million for logistical supply chain maintenance, $300 million for intelligence and communication systems. Weekly operational totals, $18 billion for sustained military operations against Iranian forces and regional proxy networks. These projections assume limited conventional operations without expansion into broader regional conflict involving Iranian allies or proxy forces throughout Middle East. Escalation scenarios involving Hezbollah, Hamas, Iraqi militias, Yemeni forces, or Syrian government forces multiply operational costs by factors that Pentagon analysis describes as fiscally catastrophic for sustained periods exceeding 30 days. Full regional conflict costs projected at $35 to $45 billion weekly for operations across multiple theaters with extensive proxy network engagement. American national debt currently $38.5 trillion with annual interest payments exceeding $1 trillion, daily deficit spending $2 billion under normal operational conditions. Iranian conflict adds $18 billion weekly to deficit spending. That already exceeds sustainable levels through existing fiscal mathematics. 90-day Iranian conflict totals, $2.3 trillion additional debt accumulation. 6% increase in total national debt through single military operation lasting 3 months. Debt service costs increase proportionally with additional borrowing requirements that compound existing fiscal impossibility through military expenditure beyond economic capacity. But Iran conflict costs include factors that Pentagon projections acknowledge cannot be quantified accurately due to asymmetric warfare variables that historical precedent shows always exceed initial estimates. Iranian capability to disrupt global oil supplies through Strait of Hormuz closure. Economic impact, $200–400 billion in global economic disruption through energy price spikes and supply chain breakdown. Iranian proxy activation throughout Middle East, requiring American response across multiple geographic theaters. Operational cost multiplication through simultaneous conflicts that exceed bilateral projection parameters. Iranian alliance systems with Russia and China creating potential for proxy support that extends conflict duration and complexity beyond American strategic planning assumptions. Regional escalation potential involving Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, creating multilateral conflicts that require American involvement across expanded operational theaters. Combined escalation factors suggest actual conflict costs could exceed Pentagon projections by 200–400% through variables that become inevitable once military operations begin, but cannot be prevented through strategic planning. Historical precedent shows asymmetric conflicts always exceed initial cost projections by substantial margins, while extending beyond projected timelines through defensive advantages that favor resistance forces over expeditionary operations. Iranian conflict represents perfect conditions for military expenditure beyond fiscal capacity because geographic, strategic, and alliance factors combine to create maximum cost burden on American operations while minimizing Iranian defensive expenses. The mathematical trap functions regardless of military outcomes because costs exceed sustainable levels before strategic objectives can be achieved through force application. But there's something more significant revealed by Pentagon cost analysis. American military-industrial complex has created operational requirements that multiply basic conflict costs through technological complexity and logistical demands that exceed historical warfare expense patterns. Modern American military operations require technological systems that consume resources at rates unprecedented in military history. Precision weapons costing millions per unit, electronic warfare systems requiring constant technical support, logistical networks maintaining technological superiority across maximum geographic distances. Historical military operations function through relatively simple resource requirements that could be sustained through basic industrial capacity and supply chain management. Modern American military depends entirely on technological systems that require industrial resources and logistical complexity that multiply basic operational costs by factors that make sustained conflicts economically impossible regardless of strategic importance. Iranian conflict reveals that American military capacity has evolved beyond American economic capacity to sustain operations against determined resistance utilizing asymmetric strategies designed to exploit technological dependency vulnerabilities. Military technological superiority becomes economic disadvantage when conflict duration exceeds fiscal capacity to maintain technological systems through extended operations against opponents utilizing simpler defensive strategies. This represents evolution of military mathematics that historical empires never faced because technological complexity has created cost structures that exceed imperial economic sustainability regardless of strategic necessity or military effectiveness. Iranian conflict costs $18 billion weekly because American military operations require technological and logistical complexity that Iranian defensive operations exploit through strategic patience and geographic advantages. The cost differential creates mathematical impossibility, where military victory becomes economically meaningless because achieved through expenditure that bankrupts the empire attempting to secure strategic objectives through force. Pentagon projections acknowledge this reality through classified analysis that recognizes Iranian conflict represents fiscal catastrophe, regardless of military outcomes achieved through American technological superiority. 90-day timeline represents maximum sustainable period for Iranian conflict before cumulative costs trigger fiscal crisis that eliminates American capacity to continue military operations anywhere globally. Historical precedent suggests this timeline might be optimistic because modern warfare cost multiplication could accelerate fiscal breakdown beyond Pentagon projection parameters. Roman, British, and Soviet military overextension created fiscal crisis gradually over years of expensive operations. American military technology creates fiscal crisis immediately through operational costs that exceed historical precedent by massive margins. Iranian conflict represents the final military expenditure that transforms gradual American decline into immediate fiscal collapse through mathematical inevitability disguised as strategic necessity. The leaked Pentagon projections confirm what sophisticated fiscal observers recognized months ago. American military capabilities have evolved beyond American economic capacity to utilize those capabilities against determined resistance. Military technological superiority cannot overcome fiscal mathematics when conflict costs exceed economic sustainability, regardless of strategic objectives or operational effectiveness. Iranian conflict costs $18 billion weekly because asymmetric warfare strategies exploit American military dependency on technological systems that multiply operational expenses beyond fiscal capacity. 90 days of Iranian conflict adds $2.3 trillion to debt that already exceeds sustainable levels through existing fiscal mathematics. The mathematics don't care about strategic necessity or military objectives. They unfold according to fiscal impossibility that no amount of military success can overcome once costs exceed economic capacity. Imperial military overextension during fiscal crisis always accelerates rather than prevents imperial collapse through expenditure beyond sustainable limits. Iran represents the perfect military trap for an empire already facing mathematical impossibility through unsustainable debt accumulation. The Pentagon knows. The projections prove it. Historical precedent predicts the outcome. Military victory achieved through bankrupting expenditure destroys empires faster than military defeat, while creating illusion of strength that masks fundamental economic breakdown. Iranian conflict represents America's final military adventure before fiscal mathematics eliminate capacity for power projection beyond domestic territorial limits. The costs are absolute, the timeline is immediate, the outcome is written by imperial fiscal mathematics that no military technology can overcome. $18 billion per week, 90 days until bankruptcy. Mathematical inevitability disguised as strategic challenge. The pattern never changes because fiscal mathematics never change. Military overextension during debt crisis destroys empires regardless of military capabilities or strategic objectives. Iranian conflict confirms the pattern while completing the sequence. The final military expenditure that finishes what fiscal irresponsibility began. Pentagon projections leaked. Historical precedent confirmed. Mathematical outcome approaching with certainty. Empire-ending conflicts always seem necessary until they end the empire attempting them.